scenes between this left-wing and right-wing faction within the American power structure during the Second World War, might explain why Hiss was outed and kind of thrown under the bus. Because he was a Soviet spy, but at the end of the day, the Soviets were assets of the Atlanticist powers, the banksters, the international bankers, the Rothschilds, and the Second World War was waged to create a situation to create the bipolar world of the Cold War, and as part of a stepping stone toward the New World Order. And I guess perhaps Stalin didn't cooperate somewhat. So some people interpret Stalin as sort of an unwitting hero against the New World Order, because he didn't really cooperate, and so we got the Cold War. But yeah, Dean Acheson, didn't he also represent the Soviet interests before they were diplomatically recognized by the Roosevelt administration in 1933?
Yes, going back to when he was a young attorney, he was actually selected by Joseph Stalin to represent Soviet interests in America. So, again, this man being the one who personally persuaded Lyndon Baines Johnson to escalate in Vietnam, it just doesn't have credibility that he was that motivated to fight communism without some ulterior motive. And you could look at NATO. Was sold as a bulwark against communism, but there's another aspect to that, which was it was uniting. It was creating Oceania. It was creating this unity between America and Europe, and this is what they were after. In fact, there was an article in the Council on Foreign Relations flagship journal, Foreign Affairs, called Atlantica, and it envisioned this state, the same state really that pretty much that Orwell envisioned as Oceania, where there'd actually be a political bond, that'd actually be a politically united America and Europe. And this would be, they called this the Atlantic Union. And there was a big effort to create Atlantic Union. It was turned down by Congress, but they actually wanted to unify us, much as they've tried to turn NAFTA into a North American Union. This was actual plan in the 1950s. So when they talked about fighting communism, it wasn't that they were really against the communist entity, but they'd done so much to build up. And of course, you're familiar with books like The Best Enemy That Money Can Buy, and Joseph Finder's Red Carpet. There's been a lot of documentation about all the assistance we gave to the communists, and not just during the Lend-Lease of World War II, but before and after the war. There were so many figures. David Rockefeller had his plane had private landing rights in Moscow during the height of the Cold War. I mean, there was all this trade going on all the time while we were talking Cold War.
There's even some suggestion that David Rockefeller is the one that sacked Khrushchev.
Yes, because Khrushchev was sacked shortly after his visit in 1964, and it was hard not to make a connection, given the almighty role that Rockefeller has played in international politics.
George Soros is almost like the late 20th, 21st century version of Arm & Hammer. Remember him?
Yes, Occidental Petroleum, and he. By the way, his jet also had private landing rights in Moscow during the Cold War.
And people should think, why is this guy? He's a billionaire. Why is he? Why is he sympathetic towards communism? And if you were fooled by the left-right paradigm, this created sort of cognitive dissonance. But if you understand why the billionaires like socialism, because they're collectivists, they see themselves as being among the nomenclator in such a system. But again, if you understand, the works of, like as you mentioned, Anthony Sutton's work and these things at that level, as Anthony Sutton said, there's no difference between someone in the Supreme Soviet, high-ranking guy, and maybe a billionaire here in the West, other than the fact that ultimately, I think those in the Soviet Union who actually were employed by the bankers in the West, because they needed the funding, because communism just didn't work, and it was designed not to work, because it would keep Russia poor and weak. And perhaps Russia got a little stronger than they anticipated. I don't know. These plans aren't executed flawlessly, and as things do occur, it makes them have to make changes and improvise, because in reality, human relations, it's complex, and central planning doesn't work. But nevertheless, they're the ones behind the curtain or pulling the strings. And the connections you pointed out really make the Cold War makes no sense if you accept the Henry Luce Time Life version of the Cold War, the mainstream media account. That was retailed to us. But you could look at the Cold War as sort of a strategy of tension writ large, and that was just an international application of that strategy. Whereas here in the '60s in the United States, it was a domestic application in the '60s. But this type of tension that we saw in the '60s, and the kind of tension and trouble we saw throughout the entire 20th century, was foreseen, by the Carnegie Foundation, which was exposed by Catherine Casey and working for Norman Dodd when she was reading the minutes of this foundation. They talked about they predicted or foresaw the best way to fundamentally change, collectivize the United States is to subject it to a series of wars and conflicts, and you could say that you could look at the Great Depression perhaps as a sort of a shock doctrine type approach to that, and also the wars itself as a way to fundamentally change the country, scar the country, and certainly it did. America was a much different country in 1946 than it was in 1917, and mission accomplished.
Many times, and certainly with the Vietnam War, even more so. But yeah, there's always been this relationship between the bankers, and it's very easy to document the role of the bankers in bankrolling the beginnings of communism in 1917 when Kuhn Loeb funded Trotsky with $20 million in gold, and they also set up an account in Sweden for Lenin and Trotsky with $50 million in it. And of course, one of the partners in Kuhn Loeb in America was Paul Warburg. Well, his brother Max Warburg in Germany arranged that trip of Lenin into Russia. Coming up all these 100th anniversaries this year, the Bolshevik Revolution began in 1917. But he arranged for Lenin to go in with millions in gold on that famous train. And so the bankers were always involved, and they got paid back. By the way, I have an article called "Do Americans Face a Red Terror?" It was written about 3 years ago, but it talks about how the banks and the Freemasonic lodges got payback in Russian wealth from the early Bolsheviks. And it's not me who uncovered that. It was actually Jiri Lina in his book Under the Sign of the Scorpion. He went into the KGB files after Glasnost had opened them up and found that even the order to execute the Tsar had come from New York City, not from Lenin himself. But then you take it ahead. This is a quote that I find very relevant to why communism and capitalism work together. This is from a Fabian socialist named Nicholas Murray Butler speaking in 1937. He said, quote, "Communism is the instrument with which the financial world will topple national governments and then erect a world government with a world police and a world money," unquote. And unquote. And so the way I've always seen these revolutions, and this is why I often speak favorably about monarchies, is the Rothschilds always viewed monarchies, be it the Emperor of China or the Tsar in Russia or any of the kings of Europe. They wanted to topple these monarchs because they could not get into the bloodline of a monarch. So they wanted the monarchs to go so that they could install quote-unquote democracy. This is what I was just talking about in Vietnam with Bao Dai and being replaced by Nguyen Dinh Diem and an electoral system. Get rid of the monarchs, and then they knew they couldn't control the monarchs necessarily, but they could control the democratic process because in a democracy, people will vote for who the newspapers tell them to vote for. And, of course, the Rothschilds with their wealth could always control the newspapers and so control public opinion that their candidates would always be selected. So communism is a tool that they've used to get rid of governments they didn't like. It's not really an end of itself. But, as a matter of fact, here's an interesting quote. So many of these bankers were Zionists. I can't read the quote here, but it's I printed it out, and it's from a graphic.
No,
graphic doesn't, but it was a quote from Stephen Wise, who was a leading Zionist in America in the 20th century. He said that basically said that Judaism is the same thing as communism. And when you look at the fact that anti-Semitism was made a capital offense by Lenin, and it was the death penalty on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and you look at the 85% of the Soviet leadership was Jewish in those early days, you realize that there's a very powerful correlation between the two, between the bankers, most of whom are Zionists, and their Freemasonic underlings in the communist world. And that also showed up once again, raised its head during the 60s.
That was Rabbi Stephen Wise?
Yes.
He was head of the American Jewish Council, right? Or committee in the 30s and 40s?
Yeah, he was one of the major forces of Zionism and the pro-World War II and the creation of the State of Israel.
And a harsh critic of Charles Lindbergh, if I recall.
Yeah, Lindy was, in a unique position because he was an undeniable. He was actually considered the greatest hero of his time after that solo 1927 flight to Paris. And he became feared because he was so popular that he actually could have run for president and won. The problem was that he was only in his 20s when he made that flight, and it was going to take him almost maybe 8 years to become 35 and be qualified to run for president. But he was definitely feared, and the wrath of the establishment really turned on him when he joined the America First Committee and started to follow in his father's footsteps. His father, of course, being a man who wrote a book called Why Your Country is at War, which was suppressed by the U.S. government, and also a great critic of the Federal Reserve. In fact, when he was in Congress, he actually introduced a resolution to impeach the entire Federal Reserve Board. And when Lindy started to follow in his father's footsteps, at least in the anti-war sense, the wrath of the American establishment turned on him.
Yes, I think it was Charles Lindbergh Sr. who said that with the creation of the central bank, the Federal Reserve, which it was a central bank, but it was way it was designed was 12 regions, and ultimately it was the New York Fed that was dominant. So it was sort of like a secret or a central bank undercover, as opposed to a Federal Reserve controlled regionally and all that stuff. But he said that with the creation of the Federal Reserve, that booms and busts will be scientifically created.
Yes, that's exactly what he said. He was quite right, and he predicted that there would be a crash, and of course that came in 1929. He said they'll just create inflation at will, and then they'll unload the stocks on people. In fact, I can't even get the exact quote. Where you fill in with a remark here, but it's worth referring to that. The two amazing men, the Lindberghs, that they were both so accomplished. One as an opponent of the Fed, and that his son then made that very heroic trip. Initially Charles Jr. was not interested in politics. He was just interested, I think he was just 25 when he made that trip. He was really totally into flying, but